On this field, somewhere in northern Virginia, on a particular summer day in 1861, only about 20 miles from the nation's capital and about 3 months removed from the events of Fort Sumter, two great armies will converge. Two great armies who are completely inexperienced in the art of war and absolutely clueless as to the horrors that they will unleash upon this nation. For their presence on this field will bring us the first major battle of the Civil War. The place, Manassas Junction. The day, July 21st, 1861, and the Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas. Days earlier, President Lincoln sent his then commander of Union forces, Irvin McDowell, to march 36,000 men to Richmond and put an end to this rebellion. President Lincoln believed that the minute the rebels saw that army in Union blue marching towards them with arms, under arms, that the rebels are going to want to talk, to discuss, to negotiate an end to this. But President Lincoln underestimated their willingness to fight. And they're waiting in Manassas, waiting to intercept the Union Army, are the combined forces of rebel generals P.T. Beauregard and Joseph Johnston. And when McDowell's troops arrive in the morning of the 21st, they seem to have the advantage. They seem to be able to successfully push the Beauregard and Johnston's troops. They're not soldiers after all. And it doesn't take long after the bullets start flying to discipline to fall apart, for chaos to start to work its way through the ranks, and before you know it, you have men running in fear and terror, running for safety in every direction. And it looks like the first battle of the Confederacy may be its last, until reinforcements arrive late that day, out of the woods on horseback. The brigade led by General Thomas Jackson, who takes to the field and in doing so injects newfound courage in his fellow rebels. One general notices Jackson and his troops and makes the remark to his troops, "Look at General Jackson over there, standing like a stone wall." And apparently this was enough to rally the Southerners to start to take the fight to McDowell's troops. And wouldn't you know it, by the end of the day, they successfully do that. And now it's McDowell whose ranks are falling apart, whose men are running towards Washington, D.C. in a panic. And the first battle of the Civil War, which could have been a loss, could have been the last battle of the Civil War, ends up, thanks to a last-minute reinforcement, ends up being a Southern victory. And something that should not have happened, the Union's first engagement, is a loss. And part of the problem was that nobody really took this seriously. Lincoln didn't take it seriously. The men that went there didn't take it seriously. This was actually promoted as it was going to be some kind of a theatrical performance. Come and watch these soldiers play soldier. And people came, spectators came, and they set up picnics, only to find out that when the bullets start flying, people start dying. And before you know it, because of the lack of discipline, because of the lack of experience, panicked men and spectators are running in every direction, running for safety, running for back home. It was a win, but it was a disaster on both sides. Both sides came to the very real conclusion that this is a real war, and to fight real wars, you need real soldiers, not the men that showed up on Manassas that day. One side got lucky, and the other side got lucky not to be completely obliterated. And they're going to have to go back home, and they're going to have to turn men into soldiers. And they're going to have to turn a mob into an army. And that's pretty much going to be the rest of 1861 and well into 1862. Are there things worth mentioning? Sure. Let's talk about how naval warfare was changed forever in 1862, thanks to in the American Civil War, in the famous Battle of the Ironclads. Long story short, somebody had the ingenious idea. What happens when you take a steamboat, a riverboat, steam-driven riverboat, and encase it in iron plates? Would that make it indestructible? And that's exactly what the Southerners did. They were able to capture a steamboat called the USS Merrimack, encase it in iron, and rename it the Virginia. They don't know this, but the Union's working on a version of their own as well. Smaller, more modest, only has one gun, but it's a rotating turret. On the 8th of March, the Confederates unleashed their secret weapon. And the Virginia makes quick work of several wooden ships, Union ships, that are anchored off Newport News. The Roanoke, the Lawrence, and the Minnesota are either sunk or greatly damaged. The Confederates are jubilant. They have a secret weapon that can maybe use to turn the tide, at least in the naval campaign, maybe put an end to that blockade. On March 9th, they head out to water again, but this time they find the Monitor. And that's the day of the Battle of the Ironclads. And both of these ships fire everything they have at each other for hours. Predictably, nothing happens. Neither is able to sink one another because they're both encased in iron. But by the end of that battle, the Virginia runs out of ammunition. And rather than be boarded by the enemy, she decides to run and scuttle her own ship. Why is this important? Because it's going to change naval warfare forever. After this engagement, the Union Navy is going to start mass producing ironclads. They're great for coastal sieges. They protect your ships to the line by taking most of the damage. They're basically tanks on water. The Confederacy is going to build a couple more, but won't really be able to gain any advantage from it. But navies around the world are going to start transitioning to ironclads. And here's a picture of a turret. Maybe you can see the dents that the cannonballs made. I believe that's the Monitor. So not much is going on in the Eastern Theater of the war after Bull Run. That's not true about the West. So let's visit the Western Theater of the war. If you remember the Anaconda Plan, the plan was to march half of the Army of the Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River, west of the Appalachian Mountains. Primary objective, capture the Tennessee River, split Tennessee in half, and then start marching west and begin the same process with the Mississippi River. Ultimate objective, deny the Confederacy the use of those two very important waterways. Bull Run might have been a loss, but Union General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Army of the Tennessee, is going to give the Union its first victory in the West, because the Union does perform better in the West than it did in the East. It starts pretty early. It starts February 6th, where Grant's army comes out of Kentucky and takes Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson at the very top of where the Tennessee border meets the Tennessee River. Then marches his army south. Within 2 months, he reaches a place called Pittsburgh Landing, which is in Tennessee's southern border. There's a church nearby called Shiloh, hence that's why this battle is called the Battle of Shiloh. Over 2 days, Grant gets there, but he's pinned down. He's pinned down by the forces of General Beauregard and General Bragg and A.S. Johnston. And it looks like there's going to be a disaster for Shiloh. This is almost the reverse of Bull Run. It looks like it's going to be a disaster for General Grant, until on the 7th, General Buell arrives with reinforcements, and Grant's able to turn the tide and eventually secure Pittsburgh Landing and finish his objective in Tennessee. with a combined 23,746 combined casualties and losses over 2 days. The Battle of Shiloh is a victory, but it's the deadliest battle in the war up until that point. And there's an image of that battle. Again, Generals Johnson and Beauregard versus General Grant and Buell. The Navy has to do its part, and with Grant heading towards Mississippi to begin the seizure of the Mississippi River, the Navy does its part. Under the command of Admiral David Farragut, they fight their way through two ports. They're protecting New Orleans, Fort Jackson and St. Phillips, allowing the Navy to sail into New Orleans unopposed. In taking New Orleans, the Union Navy is able to secure the South's largest city and one of its most important ports. From that point forward, and for the duration of the war, New Orleans is going to be under Union military occupation. General Benjamin Butler is named the military governor of New Orleans from May all the way to December of 1862. And some important things that we need to keep in mind come out of Butler's governorship of New Orleans. Firstly, he imposed martial law on that city because, after all, it was a Confederate city full of Confederate sympathizers. He censored newspapers. He gave an order that would allow for the harsh treatment of any women that verbally abused or insulted Union soldiers. He actually helped that city. That city, during part of the year, was known for outbreaks of yellow fever. He imposed quarantines of sick people and rules as to, for sanitation and hygiene the city didn't have. But something happened in Washington. There's a little backstory here about Butler's involvement with the African Americans of New Orleans. The year before, if you remember John Fremont, remember, he's the first candidate the Republicans ran. He was a commissioned officer now in the Army. He's fighting guerrillas in Kentucky, Confederate guerrillas, if you will, because in Kentucky and Missouri, you didn't have formal war, but you did have war between irregulars. And we know that Fremont had, if not abolitionists, he had free soil tendencies. And one of the things that Fremont does in order to, I guess, punish or hurt those in Kentucky that were, waging war against, those that sympathized with the Union, he began to emancipate slaves. When he ran into slaves, he was just letting them go. And Lincoln got word of this, and Lincoln tells him, here's the problem. The South considers itself no longer part of the United States, but the government in Washington doesn't recognize that, still sees them as part of states of the United States, except states in rebellion. And just because they're in rebellion doesn't mean the law has ceased to exist. According to the law, we are still compelled to respect and enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. According to the law, they still have the right to own slaves, because the Fifth Amendment guarantees people the right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So we don't have a legal foot to stand on if we start emancipating slaves. And you could trigger Missouri to change their mind on secession when they hear that you're going around emancipating slaves, and we might lose Missouri. So President Lincoln tells Fremont to stop emancipating slaves. Now, this is in 1861. Eventually, word gets to Congress. Is there a way that they could deal with this issue without necessarily breaking the law? Because according to Lincoln, these states are still part of the United States and the law still applies. We do know that the Confederacy is not using slaves for soldiers. They never did. but they are using them as labor. Okay? Soldiers are fighting, but they're using slaves that have been leased out to the Confederate Army to dig ditches, to cook, to clean, to do all of the manual labor involved in war. And the argument in Congress is, what if we don't say that we're taking slaves? But what if we say that we are confiscating enemy property? The Southerners claim that their slaves are their property. Okay, fine. Does that not mean, okay, that in war, first of all, you committed an act of treachery, of treason. In that alone, you committed a crime. Having committed a crime, the Fifth Amendment allows us then to punish you by depriving you of life, liberty, or property. We can't emancipate slaves per se, but we can confiscate the property of those that are in rebellion against the United States. And so they passed the Confiscation Acts. Now, you're not emancipating slaves per se. You are confiscating enemy property. People in Kentucky and Missouri don't have to worry. They're not the enemy. They have not waged war against the United States. This only applies to those persons that are in open rebellion against the United States. That is your crime, and your punishment is your property, your slaves will be taken from you. Butler's the governor of New Orleans when this is passed, and he takes advantage of it. He uses it to confiscate cotton, beef, and sugar, and distributes it to the city's poorest residents, thereby gaining their loyalty. He comes in as the military governor of an occupying force, but then goes and he confiscates, beef, cotton, and sugar from the wealthiest of New Orleans and gives it to the poor, buying the poor's loyalty. He also starts to confiscate slaves of wealthy New Orleans and surrounding areas that still, are either engaged in war or are sympathetic to the South. In doing so, he technically starts freeing the first African Americans, although you can't call it that. They call it confiscation. He actually forms the first African American regiment that will fight in the war, called the 1st Louisiana Tigers. Keep in mind the Confiscation Act, because it's an evolution, it's a step in a direction, starting with Fremont's emancipation decrees, which Lincoln told them to stop it because they weren't sure whether legally he could be doing that, to the Confiscation Act, till eventually an even bolder act by the president's going to follow. So what is going back in the East? What is going back? Well, we know we need a real army. Bull Run was a disaster. So much of a disaster that Lincoln got rid of McDowell. That's Lincoln's, pattern. If you don't work out for me, I'm going to find out who will work out. So McDowell is relieved as commander of all Union forces. They found somebody new. 34-year-old West Point graduate, General George McClellan. He served in the Mexican-American War when he was only about 19, 20 years old. He's a young guy. Years later, he went as a secret agent to Santo Domingo under the command of then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. He knew the man, to study the prospects of annexing Santo Domingo. He was sent to Europe in the 1850s as an official observer of the Crimean War. And when he came back, based on his observation of Russian cavalry tactics, he wrote a cavalry manual that was used for many years by the U.S. Army. He had such an impressive resume that Lincoln named him General-in-Chief of Union forces and put every luxury at his disposal. Washington, D.C. was basically turned into a huge training camp. Every open space and field became a tent city by which to train soldiers. A city that was not meant to hold that many people, all of a sudden was hosting 100,000 soldiers from all over the North. Hotels were turned into officer barracks, and that's what he's doing. That's what they're doing. Starting in July 26 of 1861, He's drill, 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 march, 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 practice, 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 drill, 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 march, 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 turning northern farm boys, mechanics, factory workers into full-blown soldiers. And this goes on for months. President Lincoln would like to see eventually a quick resolution to this war because while McClellan is doing this in Washington, D.C., you could be best assured that the Confederates are doing the same thing back there in Richmond. And while we're training and preparing men to fight as real soldiers, the rebels are doing the same thing. And Lincoln is growing impatient with General McClellan. Hey, General McClellan, I gave you everything you need. You have these soldiers. You've basically turned Washington, D.C. into a training camp. Are you going to use them? What's exactly your plan? And eventually, after 8 months of march, 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 drill, 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 McClellan confirms to the president, yes, he does have a plan. This is how we're going to beat the rebels. The Peninsula Campaign. You see, Mr. President, the last Bull Run, which, by the way, also cost Winfield Scott his job. He was sent into retirement. Our mistake there is we tried to march straight to Richmond. So they knew exactly where to stop us. They intercepted us. They knew where we were coming from, and they knew where we were heading, and that was our mistake. Here's how to beat them, Mr. President. Go around them. Hit them from the sea. And so this is what the great plan of General McClellan. He's going to move 100,000 men by riverboat down the Potomac River, down the Chesapeake Bay, make landfall somewhere in Virginia, and then marches troops westward towards Richmond. I guess the rationale is if the rebels have set up defenses, they're all facing the north because that's where the enemy is. They'll never expect us coming from the east. And we'll be able to take advantage of the fact, because McClellan actually believes that nobody's going to notice riverboats carrying 100,000 soldiers down the Chesapeake Bay. That's exactly what happens. And General McClellan, General-in-Chief of the U.S. Army, Commander of the Army of the Potomac, that is the official name of the Union Army based out of Washington, D.C., and the one that is going to fight most of the Union's fights in the Eastern Theater. He's up against Beauregard, was not demoted but set aside for General Joseph E. Johnston, who is now the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, those forces that are based out of Richmond, Virginia, and will do most of the fighting in between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. March 17th is when they finally find a landing site at Fort Monroe. Union troops disembark their riverboats, begin to march east-northeast towards Richmond. Doesn't take long. April 5th, they run into Johnson's defensive lines. So successful and impenetrable those defensive lines are that the Union forces have no choice but to take to the sea again. They head towards Yorktown, and on riverboat, they sail up the York River, landing at a place called West Point. That's not the West Point from the Army. That's another place called West Point. West Point has a rail that leads right into Richmond. They secured West Point, and from there begin their march towards the enemy capital. By late May, they are just north of the enemy capital, 6 miles from the enemy capital, in a place called Seven Pines. And at the Battle of Seven Pines, General McClellan and General Johnston will do battle for the last time. It's also known the Battle of Fair Oaks. It's also a name for it. Advance after advance by the Union towards the rebel capital was repelled time and time again by Johnston's forces. At great cost, they were able to stop the attacks, and the Union fell back. Yes, the the South was able to at least um, secure the victory of keeping the Union from marching into Richmond. But they did lose General Johnston for a while. He was severely injured. Um, Not only was he injured, but this battle shook um, General McClellan. It sapped the morale out of the Northern Army. McClellan said something in his diary that he wrote to his wife, because he would write to his wife a lot. And in what he said, you could tell that this battle might have been lost already at this point. I am tired of the sickening sight of the battlefield with its mangled corpses and poor suffering wounded. Victory has no charms for me when purchased at such a cost. Here's another thing, keeping McClellan from advancing into Richmond, not only because Johnston gave him some very successful efforts to keep him from marching in, but he's also waiting for reinforcements. The hope is once those reinforcements come in, they could hit Richmond from two different flanks, if you will. But those reinforcements are not coming. As McClellan is working his way towards Richmond, President Lincoln sends Generals McDowell and Generals Banks down the Shenandoah Valley on the road to Richmond. But along the way, they are harassed time and time again by General Stonewall Jackson's Stonewall Brigade. A little bit about General Jackson that ends up being a very iconic figure in the Civil War. He was formerly an instructor, a West Point graduate, Mexican-American War veteran, like most of them were. Also, an instructor at the Virginia Military Institute, an artillery instructor. Apparently, he was not very charismatic. His students tried to get rid of him several times. He was very, very religious, kind of odd. He hung around with a bag of lemons, claiming it was good for him. I guess he's talking about vitamin C. He would ride into battle with one arm in the air, claiming it was good for his circulation. But beside his quirks, he was fearsome in battle and a very inspirational commander to his men. And he was able to successfully harass Banks and McDowell to the point that it obstructed them. It kept them from reaching Richmond when McClellan could have used their help the most. So, Stonewall's actions in the Shenandoah Valley also assisted McClellan's, inevitable, disappointment outside Richmond. With Johnston injured, Davis turns to his military advisor. Remember him, Colonel Robert E. Lee. Colonel Robert E. Lee was the same colonel that led Marines to capture John Brown in 1859. He was the same Robert E. Lee that shortly after Fort Sumter was offered command of the Union Army and turned it down because he was a Virginian first, and Virginia has seceded from the Union. And he lends his sword, if you will, to the Confederate cause. And he is Davis's chief military advisor. Remember, Davis is his own Secretary of War. Well, Johnston out of the picture, Davis sends Lee out there to take command of Johnston's forces and keep McClellan from, attempting to enter Richmond. And so Lee takes to the field with the Army of Northern Virginia. Starting on June 25th through July 1st, in a series of battles that take place over 7 days, Lee, being way more aggressive than Johnston before him, attacks McClellan's forces time and time again, forcing them to fall back and fall back and fall back until they reach Malvern Hill. They had a bit of more luck there. Malvern Hill was a little bit more defendable, but Lee outmaneuvered, outfought McClellan, and eventually forced him across the James River. And in doing so, secured the safety of his capital. After all was said and done, Lee lost 20,000 men out of his total 90,000 men. in order to keep the capital from the hands of the Union. McClellan lost a lot of men too, 16,000 out of 105,000 men. But the most important takeaway from the 7 days battles, which was the last battles that marked the Peninsula campaign, it completely crushed Northern morale. It completely crushed McClellan's sense of confidence that he could see this campaign through. Realizing that reinforcements are not coming and that he lacks the men, the manpower, and the willingness to break through and continue to march towards Richmond, not facing Lee and Lee's more aggressive tactics. McClellan makes a fateful decision. He decides to order a retreat. And all the 8 months of preparation and marching up that peninsula from March all the way to June ends up being in vain. And McClellan orders the Army of the Potomac back to Washington, D.C., back to the drawing board. The news hits Washington, D.C. like a ton of bricks. Another defeat by an enemy force that should not have been able to pull that off. Lincoln decides, well, he actually decided that maybe McClellan no longer should be General in Chief. And he offers that job to General Henry Halleck. McClellan stays in command of the Army of Northern Virginia, but no longer General in Chief of Union Army as a whole. And whereas the war marked one of the first stumbling blocks, the battle marked one of the first stumbling blocks for General McClellan, it actually did the complete opposite for Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, landed aristocrat, grandson of Henry Lighthorse Lee, a hero of the American Revolution, married to one of the granddaughters of George Washington through Martha Custis. If you ever heard of Arlington Cemetery, well, before it was a cemetery, it was an estate. It was the estate owned by General Lee, who, if you've ever been there, that's just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. You can make the argument that he was more of a resident of Washington than he was of the rest of Virginia. And yet, he married his cause to the Confederate cause. And thanks to his outstanding performance at the Battle of 7 Days battles, Davis decided to just keep him as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. And without saying so, pretty much General-in-Chief of all Confederate forces, although his preoccupation would mostly be with the Army of Northern Virginia. And General Lee would stay in command of the Army of Northern Virginia until the end of the war. And so with this slide, we end this particular video in the introduction of one of the most iconic, gigantic figures of the Civil War. Perhaps one of the most talented, inspirational, tenacious military commanders. I would even argue that, in the entire military history of the world, many have argued that General Lee was the best thing and the worst thing that could have happened to the Confederacy. The best thing is they could not have picked a more talented, more resourceful general. And that was the bad thing too. Because had they not had that general that was possessed of such talent and resourcefulness, that war would not have lasted 4 years. And it's exactly because it lasted 4 years that it ended up putting so many Southern men in their graves. And maybe all that could have been prevented with a much briefer war under the command of a less talented leader. But that is speculation. That is not the way history turned out. So we're going to spend some time with Lee in the upcoming videos because he is a rather large figure in the history of all of this. Next time, we'll see what Lee did with that army and how the war would be impacted by it.